Hello there. You're about to listen to a recorded portion of a worship service at Maryville Friends Church. We upload our children's worship and our sermons for those who aren't able to be here on a given Sunday, or for those who might simply be interested in what we're doing. We hope you find this recording to be a blessing on your day. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you need me to hold something for you?
Oh, no, I'm going to drop it all on my toe. No, I'll be fine.
Smaller on this one.
Oh, okay. This is children's worship. Now, I don't see any little children here, and this was prepared for small or big children. I see big children here. We're all big children, aren't we? Now, if you have your smartphone, we can go, what is that, technical or smartphone-wise, you can go to God is Near on, how did they get to it? At Google, just God is Near. That's what we're using. So if you want to get your smartphone out, you'll have the words to the thing that I'm going to be talking about today. All right, our lesson is going to be on near and far. Those are things you got to teach children. You know, you're near Joan. Okay, now I'm near Joan. Look at that. I'm near Joan. Now I'm way far away from Joan. Okay, buddy Joan. All right, now you all practice near and far. Okay, if you're sitting near, let's say that near is the middle of the aisle. And so everybody go near to the middle of the aisle. And you can get close to Bill. It won't hurt you to get close to Bill. You can move just a little bit. He's going near. You can move just a little bit over near to the middle of the aisle. Now we're near. Okay, there we're near. All right, now go back. I'm moving y'all around. We're going to get woken up here. Go far now, away. Now you're way away from the middle of the aisle. Okay, she's leaning. That's good. You can lean away. Now, you practice near and far. And now let's talk about my inspiration. It came again out of the Quaker Life, and you'd think I was the advertisement for the Quaker Life, but I don't mean to be. But this started when I was reading this little poem in here called Sometimes. Sometimes I feel close to God. It's amazing. I'm sure, too, that many friends feel this closeness sometimes. Thank thee, God, for this gift, even if it's only sometimes. And that was Harold Vadova, Sandy Spring, Maryland. And then in our scriptures, in James 4:8, and this thing went black. Okay, you'll have to freshen it or whatever for me. It says, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. So keeping that thought, yeah. I was wanting to share with you a song that I remember from my childhood, I guess, because this was in childhood poems. And it's called God is Near, and I'm not a singer, and if you have a smartphone, you can find the words to it, but and I'm going to try to sing it, because this is how I remember it. Sometimes when morning lights the sky and gladness fills the air, I feel like telling things to God. He seems so very near. Sometimes when flowers are in bloom and birds are singing clear, I feel like singing things to God. He must be very near. Sometimes when work and play are done and evening stars appear, I feel like whispering things to God. He is so very near. Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord, thank you for being so very near. Amen.
Good morning, friends. It's great to see all of you this morning. I'd like to open up by reading out of the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, if you'd like to follow along. It's a fairly lengthy passage, but I think you'll all recognize it once I start. Exodus 20, starting with verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Let us pray. God, we thank you for bringing us together this morning and for the chance to lift our voices and open our hearts. We ask that these words about to be spoken and any words that come from the communion time to follow will be inspired by your Spirit and will be put to your use. We ask this in your name. Amen. Like I said, probably a fairly familiar passage there in Exodus. If you remember last week, I said I'd like to spend a few weeks talking about the Sabbath, and especially exploring the idea of it from a few different directions, looking at it on a couple different levels of understanding, asking where it comes from. Why did the Jewish people practice it? This intentional day of rest and of stillness and of quiet, which we as Christians have more or less carried over from their Bible, our Old Testament. Last week, we looked at it from the perspective of a simple human biological need to rest from the work we've been doing and enjoy the fruits of our labor, which was illustrated for us by God's actions in the very beginning, at the time of creation, when he took a day of rest after 6 days of creation. And I said it's kind of like the idea in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you can deal with worrying about respect for others only after you've worried about having access to food and water for yourself. In the same way, kind of as an analogy, before we could talk about some of the more complicated reasons for the Sabbath, we needed to appreciate just the basic need of us as humans, as created creatures, for rest and for recreation. Recreation, but it comes from recreation, to create again. But we talked about that. With that in mind, what about one of those more complex reasons for why the Jewish people back then and we today, and the Jewish people today, of course, have a need for Sabbath time, have a need for a day of rest? Well, let's look at that passage we read this morning, just a few minutes ago. Like I said, I'm sure we're all very familiar with the Ten Commandments, right? I think all of us here at least appreciate and understand the idea behind them. If not the specifics, not everybody, of course, memorized the Ten Commandments when they were little, but a lot of people did. But even if you haven't memorized every one and can name them in order, at the very least, everybody here, I think, understands the basic idea behind them. When I was little, they were basically explained to me as 10 basic rules for living, kind of the basics about how to live your life, that later got expanded into a much more complicated labyrinth of legal code where you could only do certain things, and 600 and whatever number of laws that the rabbis came up with. That was essentially how it was explained to me when I was little. These are the basics. If you deal with these, then you're in good shape. And to some extent, it's much simpler, really, to stick with what Jesus said later in the Gospels. As Christians, we have the great commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy soul, and all thy mind, and all thy strength. And the second that is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. And as Christ said, that all the law and all the prophets hang off of those two commandments. But despite that, of course, the Ten Commandments have stuck with us. Because they are pretty basic. They are pretty easy to remember. And it's a nice round number. 10. Especially in a society that's becoming more and more and more decimal based. 10 is a really easy thing to base your number of rules off of. And yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Your 10 basic rules for living. But there's more to it. From the point of view of Bible scholars and archaeologists, the Ten Commandments can also be looked at and can be classified as something more than just a top 10 rules. That might be on the David Letterman show. More than that, these 10 Commandments and this whole passage in Exodus 20 serves as a treaty of allegiance. A document where the people of Israel swear their fealty to God. Where God presents them with this outline. Here's what you need to abide by in this treaty with me. And it becomes a mark of their covenant relationship with God. Has anybody here ever heard of something called a suzerainty treaty? Probably not. It's a weird-sounding word that's fallen out of fashion when talking about politics because it doesn't get used much these days because the idea behind it has fallen out of favor because the world is so much different today than it was thousands of years ago in the time of the Old Testament. Basically, the idea behind this is you have a larger, really powerful kingdom, empire, nation that has control over the foreign affairs and the military affairs of a smaller, less powerful kingdom, nation, state, but basically leaves their domestic politics alone. Gives them some limited amount of control over their own internal affairs. In the ancient world, this is a really, 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 really common way for different kingdoms to be in relationships with one another. It essentially makes a smaller group of people a dependent, a subordinate to the larger group, but lets them maintain their own identity, lets them handle most of their own affairs, and just help out in whatever war the larger empire needs. As long as they're not rebelling, as long as they're not going against the larger empire, they're basically left to run their own affairs. This larger group, was called a suzerain. I'm not sure where the word comes from, but that's where we get the phrase suzerainty treaty. Like I said, it's mostly fallen out of practice in today's world, just with the way the world is set up. One of the closest examples for us today, if you think about the relationship between the United States and the various Indian nations. Think of the Cherokee Nation, the Navajo Nation. To some extent they have control over their own domestic affairs. But they're also dependent on the United States in terms of, military affairs, foreign affairs. The Cherokee Nation doesn't have treaties with Sweden, but they're part of whatever the U.S. does. Anyway, like I said, in the ancient Middle East, this is a really common way for empires to grow and to deal with the people around them. The Hittites did this, the Egyptians did this, the Assyrians did this. They all had those kinds of relationships with smaller powers, and at various times, this would include the political nature of Israel, of the kingdom of Israel, when it became a kingdom. It's where if you read in 2 Kings, the Assyrians invade, and they do some conquering, and then they make a treaty with the Israelites. And the Israelites are allowed to do their own thing for the most part, but they answer to the Assyrians now. Because of this basic understanding of the way the world worked politically, there was an established form that archaeologists have found that the Hittites used. And a lot of the features of it match Exodus 20. Modified for the beliefs of the Israelites, but in a lot of ways it fits. There is the preamble, which identifies the parties that are involved. I am the Lord your God. This is God declaring, I am your Lord. I am your God. Like I said, it's modified slightly because it's identifying it as God. There's a prologue where it lists the deeds that were performed by the larger party on behalf of the smaller party. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. This is what I've done for you. That's followed by some stipulations. And the stipulations is the heart, the meat of this treaty, which we know as the Ten Commandments. Terms that are going to be upheld by the smaller party as long as the treaty is in effect. When we go into these, no other gods before me. No graven images. Don't misuse God's name. Remember the Sabbath day, and so on and so forth. These are the things that you as Israel have to do to maintain a good relationship with your sovereign, with your suzerain, with the guy who's given you protection and has brought you out of Egypt and will keep you safe. Unfortunately, they broke that treaty many, many times, which is how they ended up being. Anyway, that's another story which we also know very well. So there's the stipulations, there's blessings and curses. Blessings if it's upheld, curses if they're not upheld. So you see there in verse 5 and 6. I am a jealous God, punishing the children of those who hate me, showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments, curses and punishments. So let's say this all seems fair, and from the Bible scholar perspective, okay, I can see where this came from, I can see how this makes sense. What does that actually have to do with the Sabbath? What does that actually have to do with our understanding of what it means to be in a relationship with God? Like I said, one of the stipulations of the Israelites being protected, being cared for, because that's the reason that these smaller groups, these smaller kingdoms would have these relationships. Well, we're not going to be able to control our foreign affairs, but on the other hand, we're not going to be conquered and overrun by the Hittites because the Egyptians are offering us protection. Sounds almost like gang warfare today, but kind of the same principle, except just on a larger scale. We'll take care of you as long as you do what we say. And that's why they would do this. One of the stipulations is, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And it's not buried down there very deep. It's not number 8 or number 7. It's number 4, pretty high up, before murder, before stealing, before giving false testimony. The number 4 thing that the Israelites need to do is honor this Sabbath day that God instituted. Have no other gods before me. That's fairly obvious for number 1. The graven images thing is for another day's talk, but really important back then. Don't misuse the name of God. Became one of the most critical things of Judaism. And then remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And this one also gets a lot of explanation. How you should do this. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. Don't do any work, not you, not your kids, not your servants, not your animals. Interestingly. I'm not sure how you keep an animal from working, except don't hook a plow up to it, I guess. And then it says, in 6 days, calling back to Genesis, this is why we're doing this. So for the Israelites, this became something more than just a recognition of a need as humans. Because anybody can say, well, you got to have some time to rest. Just a basic human need. But for the Israelites, this became something more than just, well, it would be good for us if we did this. This was more important, apparently, in their relationship covenant with God than not killing each other. This was more important than not stealing from each other, was remembering the Sabbath day. So for the Israelites, it became a form of obedience to the agreement that they made, to their agreement with God. God will offer us protection as long as we do these things, one of which is taking some time out. God, as this protector, as this sovereign, offers all of these things if the stipulations in the treaty that is agreed to are met. And so if you were to go back and could speak Hebrew and ask one of these ancient people in Israel, why do you keep the Sabbath? Why is this important to you? And they might answer, why do we keep the Sabbath? It's a matter of obedience. It's a matter of allegiance, of being part of God's people. One of the things that we must do is rest. One of the things that the people of God are required to do as an act of obedience is nothing sometimes. It's kind of a radical statement of obedience, to do nothing. And there's more to it also than that. See, for ancient people that would enter into these kind of treaties and would have these kind of relationships with, the Hittites and their gods and the Babylonians and their gods, they would kind of try and take on the characteristics. It was part of their worship. And we see that something similar in verse 11 here. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is the reason why God is stipulating as an act of obedience. Is it a sign that you are attempting to be, as much as anybody can, attempting to be like God, trying to take on those characteristics, trying to emulate the way a small child tries to emulate a parent, tries to play dress up, has the clothes in the trunk and puts them on, says, I'm just like mommy, I'm just like daddy. Not the most dignified way to think of the ancient Israelites, but there's a similar principle here in their relationship to God. It becomes a declaration of identity, of who they are as a people. It becomes a form of radical self-identification. We serve God. We are the servants of God, and we show it One of the ways that we show that we are the people of God, one of the ways that we're in obedience to Him, is by taking this intentional day of rest in the same way that God in the creation took an intentional day of rest. We are not the people of Dagon. We are not the people of Baal. We are not the people of Ishtar. The Babylonians and the Canaanites had their own ways of identifying themselves. We are the people of El Shaddai. We are the people of Adonai. We are the people of... I can't actually use God's name, which is why I have all these other names for God. We are God's people, and this is how we show our allegiance and our identification with Him. In the same way that people today, when they enter into service in different ways, take an oath. I will uphold and defend such and such a thing. And they show it by their actions. In the same way, the people of Israel were living out their covenant relationship with God by doing these commandments, one of which was take a day of rest. This is part of why the prophets railed so much against the people for breaking the Sabbath. I'll talk more about what the prophets had to say about Sabbath next week. But part of why breaking Sabbath was so bad was because keeping it was a sign of allegiance and a sign of identification and a sign of obedience to God. It served as a reminder. It served as a reminder to themselves, as Israelites, as Jews, and it also served as a reminder to others and a mark to others. They didn't have tattoos. They didn't wear, flag emblems. The priests had certain robes and certain garments, but for the regular, everyday person of Israel, the way they declared to all the other peoples that they were God's was by taking a day of rest. Now, if you were a Philistine, or if you were a Babylonian, or if you were an Egyptian, and you saw everything stopped one day for your neighbors, you might think to yourself, that's really strange. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if, are they not worried that they might be invaded, during this particular day? It's another element in the obedience and in the allegiance for the Israelites in having the Sabbath day. It's an incredible level of trust. It's an incredible level of trust, declaration that we trust that God will provide by saying, we can go for a day and not do anything. And we trust that the preparation that we've made will see us through. We trust that God will see us through anything that comes up in that particular day. Not working for a whole day, just stopping. In a society like that back then, an agrarian society that depended upon the daily chores. I've never been a dairy farmer, but the amount of chores that are required, even for farmers today, to not do those for a whole day would have been mind-blowing back then. It's a sign of trust. What about this? What about this? God will take care of it. And then if you expand that, if you read further in Exodus and the law, and you read about the year of Jubilees, where an entire year that goes by without work, I can't even imagine how that worked for them. That was a real full expression of trust in God's provision and their preparation. And that's hard. Now, for us today as Christians, we think of it as more of an individual thing. The world today isn't the same. For various reasons, I don't think it's feasible for all of society to just stop for a day. But for us, for our lives, think about this. If we say we are the people of God, if we say we trust in His provisions, if we say we are obedient, which, as Christians, I think is fair to say, can we do this? Is it hard for a lot of people? Absolutely. Is it necessary? We talked last week about the necessity of it just from a basic human health perspective. Here we see it as part of being one of God's people. A necessity, a requirement, a responsibility, if you want to think of it in a more positive way. And if you don't like to think of obligations, if you don't like to think of things I have to do, think of it as a responsibility, as an opportunity to show your trust. Like I said, that's really hard to do for a lot of people. But we still need to find ways to do it. We still need to find ways to honor the Sabbath and to keep it holy. Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love thy neighbor as thyself. All of the law and all the prophets hang on this. But that doesn't mean we don't need to look at the law and at the prophets. Right? There are still important things that we can learn. And this is one of them. We still need to find ways to honor the Sabbath and to keep it holy. We say we're people of God. Can we put our money where our mouth is? Some of the barriers I talked about last week apply here also. The barrier of being a perfectionist, and of needing to be in control, and of needing to make sure everything is exactly so, that a lot of people struggle with. The barrier of guilt, of feeling like I should be doing more, I should be doing things, I should be doing something. The barrier of having scheduling problems. The barrier of pride, where if I don't do it, it's not going to happen. And to some extent, all of those are removing God from the picture. And saying, it's all about me. It's all about the I, and not about God's provision. Trusting in God to see you through. And this is where accountability can be really helpful, where accountability can be really valuable. For the people of Israel, it was a societal thing that we would just stop. For us today, in a more individual society, which I think is to the benefit, to allow people to take Sabbath when it works for them, because not everybody, Sunday doesn't really work for me as a Sabbath, unfortunately. But for a lot of people it does. This is where accountability can be really helpful. Not the same accountability as the Israelites had, but, a friend, a spouse, a child, a parent, somebody that can say to us, have you taken a rest recently? Have you taken a day to just sit with God? To pray or to sing or to read? That's where the church steps in. Beyond that individual that we can be accountable to, we can also be accountable to one another as a body of believers, as a Christian community. And we can ask each other, have you taken a rest recently? So next time you look at the Ten Commandments, think, these aren't just things that are nice, but these are things that, for the ancient Israelites, were a sign of their allegiance to God and their dependability on Him, even when the rest of the world around seem to be against them. And ask yourself, can I be faithful in that way? So we're going to take a few minutes now, for just a few minutes, for open worship and a chance to let God's Spirit speak directly to us. And then I'll bring that communion time to a close.